afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your patience waiting for me to get here and get set up. I do have one request about the video before we get started. The images that I'm showing here depict people whose lives are in danger. So if you plan to put that online, if you can just focus it on me and not these images, because these cannot be put on the internet.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I have a lot packed into this presentation, so I'll try to watch for your questions as we go through. If I'm at a kind of a critical point in terms of explaining an argument, I may signal for you to just hold until the end or until I can answer a question, and then I'll get back to you. So do hold on to those questions that you have, and I'll allow for a little bit of time to address all of them at the end if I don't get to you during the presentation. So today's talk is called Maya Worldview in Contemporary Politics, and these are based specifically on experiences of the Kekchi Maya. The Kekchi are one of 24 Mayan ethnic groups who live within Guatemalan boundaries. There are approximately 4 others that live in Mexico. The Kekchi are one of the largest in terms of population size and in terms of territory. And they live, I'll show you here. This is the country of Guatemala, with the Petén there in the north. Some of you might know that. It's where Tikal is located. Tikal is one of the largest Mayan ruins that we have, and it's also familiar to many people because it served as one of the worlds in the original Star Wars films. The area where I've been working for about 11 years now is located right here. So we're right to the west of Lake Izabal, which is this lake here, and it's the largest lake in Guatemala. And it is also a key port strategically because it opens out to the Caribbean Sea. So this historically has been a key point for transportation of goods in and out of the country. It's also a key point because the U.S. used this to control transportation in the country throughout much of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. So to zoom in on this area, the town where I typically live is about halfway between the towns of Coban, which is the state capital, and El Estor, which is a Spanishization of the store, because there was a store founded there, and it was the first sort of general store in the area. And this region was colonized not primarily by the Spanish, who had a very difficult time conquering the Kekchi. The Kekchi had their own standing army. They were experts in navigating the land and the waters. They controlled trade, and they refused to speak anyone else's language. And so they had a very different colonization process, and a much later colonization and missionization than other Maya groups. So this whole region here is called the Polochic Valley because the Polochic River runs here from Lake Izabal all the way across here. And that river is the most voluminous in Guatemala. Oh, that's okay. I'll try to remember. I'm not used to a pointer, so bear with me. So this area is rich in natural resources. You can tell a little bit more what the topography looks like in the satellite image. The town of Panzos is where I am based. I also work in a town about halfway between here. Sorry, I'll use a pointer. There you go, so don't make a shadow. This entire area here is a natural reserve in an attempt to try to legally protect this habitat because it's a salt marsh. It's home to manatees, many species of birds. But this all flows into farmlands all along here and all along the edge of these mountains here. These are mountain ranges, both to the north and to the south. So the Kekchi and colonists, this area, like I said, was not primarily colonized by the Spanish, but rather the English, and then later primarily Germans who came over as coffee planters. They were offered large land grants by the government, and they came in, took over lands already populated by Kekchi people, and made the Kekchi their indentured servants. And so the Kekchi have been living in basically what is a feudal system of political and economic system for about the past 200 years. That has only recently been broken up with the political violence that took place in Guatemala in the 80s. And I'll get to a little more of that. So this is a picture from 2005. This is during the rainy season, so you can see how the river has overflowed its banks and the marshy areas are filling up. These are all farmlands down here. You can see how they're, they have their boundaries between different plots. They planted primarily corn, which is their traditional staple crop, beans, rice, bananas, palms, which is an African palm that produces oil, citrus, chili, peppers, and some coffee left over from the era of the coffee plantations. You can see here how they have gone all the way up to the top. They are clearing this land up here and planting it. You can see here this is a planted plot with its boundaries of either sacred or useful trees that are useful for medicinal purposes or as food crops, or for wood and firewood. So this illustrates the pressures on the land here and how far the Kekchi have been pushed in terms of trying to survive in their own territory. And this is the bank of what's called the local beach. It's a bank on the river. This is a municipal canoe, and there's a municipal worker who ferries this canoe around, ferries people back and forth up and down the river to their plots, to their homes, also takes goods back and forth. This is a hollowed out tree trunk. It's been split down the middle and opened with steam. They hold it open and then dry it again and then paint it. This is in 2005, so keep this image in your mind. This is also prime fishing grounds. This is a person, you can barely see them, but there are two people under that tree who are fishing. These are rice and corn crops back there in the background. So the Kekchi were living in this area, like I said, for several hundred years. They had settled this particular area of Pansos in the late 18th, or about the middle 18th century, when they had fled an uprising closer to Coban, which is their ancient kingdom's capital. And they were not being allowed to practice their traditional farming. There were conflicts over colonization and missionization issues. And so there was an uprising in Coban, and many people fled, and then the population was built up from there. They continued living in this area, planting it. They lived in dispersed communities where one house would be in the middle of that household's fields, so they could watch the fields. They would only come together as communities for ceremonies and for planting purposes, to help each other build houses, that kind of thing. Then the German colonists came. Like I said, the German colonists took over huge expanses of land, thousands of acres, just for one coffee plantation. And they made whoever was living on that land, basically, as far as the government and the colonists were concerned, was part of the property. It came with the deal.
When did the Germans start coming in?
Really around like the 1820s, 1821, right about there. And then they continued, there were a few before that, there were a lot after that. They really didn't, some of those families are still here. And I'll tell a little bit more of that story in just a second. So the planters came, they took over virtually all of the land. This is why the Kekchi were forced to move further and further and further up into the mountains. And they were forced to live on those properties. They were rarely, now this depended on the plantation owner, but they were rarely allowed to have schooling. They were rarely allowed to have their own fields on the plantation property. Most of the time, each head of household, which was a male, was given a small house to live in with his family. His young children were forced to labor for the same patron, which is the boss, when that child came of age, and that varied between, some were working as young as 5, the more regular age is about 10 to 15. Some of them started making female children work in the later years. And so this system persisted through the 1960s. Now, you started having some resistance from the Kekchi people as early as the 1930s. Workers started organizing themselves. This is when the communist sort of scare was getting started in Europe and the US. That rhetoric, of course, was propagated by the US all over the world, and it began to make its way into Guatemalan politics as well, as our government tried to manipulate the Guatemalan and other Central American governments, which at that time, you might know the term banana republic. These were essentially export territories for the US. So a lot of these territories were almost completely controlled economically and politically by the US government and investors like JP Morgan, Pillsbury, Bank of America, all of these corporate entities, and working together with our government, we're trying to maintain their investments in these territories, Guatemala, Panama, Honduras especially. So this person is Mama Makin. This is my Kekchi grandmother. She was one of the first women, indigenous women, to join the Communist Party. She was an official member of the Communist Party. She began to participate in that around the 1940s and 50s. She and her husband started having organizational meetings in their home. They also continued to practice Maya ceremonies, which had been kind of outlawed at the time of the communist scare because those were gatherings where people might, take political action. They were considered communist activities. And even though they might be taking place separate from people like her who were actually members of the Communist Party. So not everyone in the region knew what communism actually was. She is one of the few who did. If you ask people today, they show a lot of confusion. Some of them will say, well, the communists were the people trying to help the poor. Others would say, well, the communists were the people who would come to our houses door to door, and they would kind of scope them out and try to see what they could steal. There are a lot of different interpretations and confusion about what happened. A lot of people, more people than any other answer they will give is, well, that's what they accused me of being, was a communist guerrilla. And they don't really know what that means, other than that's why they were being chased and sometimes kidnapped or killed. So Mama Makin and her family started organizing, and they got quite a big group together. And there were competing groups in the town of Mansos. They had come from outside, up in the mountains. They had come down into the valley to work on the plantations. And then several of the plantations abandoned their lands because of political and economic conflicts. We're up into the the 30s and 40s, I should say, it flip-flopped a lot. The advent of World War II, the U.S. forced Guatemala to make a choice, and in order to ally itself with with the U.S. and maintain the support that the U.S. provided to Guatemala in terms of its government and military, as well as the economic control, because at that time, the U.S. probably controlled about 90% of the country in terms of transportation and infrastructure. So in order to maintain that alliance, Guatemala was forced to exile all Germans. And so they sent all the Germans back, even people who were Guatemalan born and had never even been to Germany. They were forced to flee the country. They returned to Germany. Then some years later, in around 44, there was a Democratic president was elected democratically, tried to institute some reforms. He started trying to redistribute the land to the Kekchi and other Maya farmers throughout the country and establish a more egalitarian political and economic system. 1954, our investors in the U.S. were panicking, and in collusion with the Guatemalan government, with the U.S. government, our military went in with the CIA and overthrew their democratically elected president, who was trying to follow up on the original reforms of the 1944 administration. And since that point in 1954, it has been virtually one stage of violence and conflict after another. So Mama Keen and other workers on the plantations were working on those plantations during these flip-flops. And these are the people who are in their 80s and 90s now. And they remember all of those different stages. There were various forms of trying to negotiate with the patrons, trying to fight for labor rights, trying to fight for better pay, trying to fight for pieces of land to plant themselves, better treatment. Originally, they were not allowed to take lunch breaks, for instance. So there were all these terms that they were trying to work out during these different phases. By the 1970s, these issues had really become very intense. There was a lot of pressure on land. There was not that much land left. There was a lot of threat and pressure in terms of how the patrons were treating the workers at that point. Many workers had organized themselves. Some of them had left. They had started clearing their own lands in hopes of being able to control their own territory and their own livelihoods. Mama Keen's group, as I said, she and her family, she had about 11 children. They came from up in the mountains, and so their organizing activities were not always taken very well by the local organizations of farmers. So locally there was tension in between and among the Kekchi farmers organizations themselves, but all of them tried to stay united against the patrons and against the local governments and those larger forces that were coming down on them. So in 1978, all of these issues started coming to a head. We'd had a lot of political conflict and violence. Like I said, since 1954, it had been increasing through the 60s and the 70s. By the time the mid-70s came around, you had a general in power who was, incidentally, a born-again Christian and very intense in his born-again beliefs and how people should behave. And that affected his ideas of how the country should be developed and what types of economic and political development should be encouraged in the country. He started threatening the people throughout the country with a program that was basically either you do what we say or we shoot you. And there were a lot of sort of catchphrases about this that they would try to bribe people with. So Mama Keen's group and the other groups were advocating, they started taking legal action as well as political action that might be something more like what we would consider activism, where they would just go onto the property of their patrons and they would just plant it themselves. And this is part of a Kekchi belief that action is what is most important, not words, not anything on paper. It is action. And through action, you show your ownership, you make claims, you demonstrate your personhood, and you demonstrate your place in the community. And so these groups of farmers were going onto these large plantation properties, planting their own fields, and then they would go out there and work the fields together. Now, together with that, they also started taking legal action. So they were traveling back and forth. Their representatives were to the country's capital in Guatemala City, filing paperwork, making claims, talking to lawyers. They got representation through some farmers, sort of like unions, not quite unions, but something like that. And then one day in May of 1978, these groups got an invitation. They report that they got an invitation from the mayor's office saying that everybody should gather on the morning of May 29th in the town square to receive news about their petitions for lands, the legal cases they were making, and also about labor rights and policy changes on the plantations. So hundreds of people came down out of the mountains, came from up and down the valley. They came the night before, and you have to remember most of these people were walking. So some of them had to walk for a couple of days to get to the municipal seat. When they arrived at the square, they noticed that it had been blocked off. It was surrounded by military police who had come into town about a week before. And they had already, the military had already been accused of raping several people. And then 3 days before, they were seen digging a large hole at the top of the cemetery with one of the primary plantation owners' tractors. A couple of his workers were working the tractor, worked most of the morning building this hole, and it's enormous. And a local teenager saw them and asked them what they were doing, and they made snide comments about how he was going to end up in the hole and his dad was going to end up in the hole. And so people were already really wary of what was going on. When they entered the square, these police were not only on the ground blocking all exits, but they were on the rooftops surrounding the square, on top of the church, on top of the municipal salon. Mama Keene and some of her children and her granddaughter, who you will see in a minute, were all present. A couple of them had babies with them. No one expected violence. But after they'd been gathered there for some time, Mama Keene stepped forward and she presented the letter to one of the municipal workers who was kind of standing toward the steps. And she asked, when they were going to get to hear about the issues that concerned them. And the legend about this day says that at that moment, a soldier screamed out, "If it's land you want, you will have it," in the cemetery. And in that moment, the mayor could be seen on the roof of the municipal building giving a signal like this, counting to 3. And on 3, they opened fire on the crowd in the square. And Mama Keene was one of the first to fall. She was shot in the head. Her granddaughter Maria, who was 12, fell underneath her as she went down. And Maria says that she had to lay there and pretend she was dead until she could see that the soldiers and the civilians who were helping the soldiers kill the people who had fallen were far enough away that she could make a run for it. And she finally did make a run for it. She ran straight for the beach that you saw just a few minutes ago, crossed that river barefooted while helicopters circled overhead, and she lived in hiding until just a few years ago. Mama Keene disappeared. Her body disappeared that day. A municipal truck gathered some of the bodies, and we have one photograph of that a local nurse took, and dumped them in that hole that the neighbor boy had seen being dug some days before. That hole was excavated in 1996. It was one of the first after the after the signing of the peace accords. And they only found 34 bodies in there. They did find Mama Keene's shawl, and so they believed that her body was in there and that it was just so badly decomposed that they couldn't find a whole skeleton. So, now, that was in 1978. When that massacre happened, news of it reverberated throughout the world. Within 2 days, there were mass protests in Guatemala City. It was on all the worldwide newswires. This was the first time that the collusion between the government and the military and the local landowners could not be denied, and that they could not get away with trying to cover up the fact that they had massacred Guatemalan citizens. And so this became emblematic. This massacre, known as the Bansos massacre, became emblematic of the violence that was happening in the country, and it is the first massacre in what would become a wave of violence that became genocidal. And so that violence continued. It peaked in about 1982 under this born-again general, who there were hundreds of massacres throughout the country, and he was in charge of most of those. The current president of Guatemala was his field commander and was in charge of many of the worst massacres himself, and there are videos of him on the battlefield if you'd like to educate yourself on current politics. Those are on YouTube. So the violence continued. 1996, peace accords were signed. However, the violence has not stopped. As part of the peace accords, there was a requirement to have a truth commission so that they could sort through what had happened, reparations could be made, and this was signed into legal agreements. The Reparations Commission and program did not get underway until almost 10 years after the agreement was signed. So they started building it in 2004, doing the legwork, trying to figure out how to put it together. And it was not until 2006, you see in this photos, that the first reparations checks were presented in Pansos. Here you see, this is Martín Arevalo. He is the son of the revolutionary president who was ousted. He was the one ousted in 1954. His predecessor was Arbenz in 1944. So the two of them are famous for trying to implement reforms, and he became the first president of the National Reparations Program. And this was an extremely important event for him to show up in the town of Pansos and recognize the victims personally. This is Maria, the granddaughter of Mama Makin and my Kekchi cousin. She has become the kind of an icon. Her grandmother became a martyr, and Maria has become an icon as a survivor. She has traveled all over speaking about the massacre, speaking about the violence, speaking against the violence, and for survivors' rights. And then this is a representative of what's called the ex-PAC. These are the former paramilitaries. Guatemala's army forced male citizens to perform service for the military. They forced them to come into these smallish community patrols and patrol their neighbors. So they were forced to report and commit crimes against their neighbors, commit violence against their neighbors. They also had a large stake in the reparations because they wanted payment for the services they were forced to do. And that's an ongoing conflict between the ones who were doing the killing and the ones who are victims. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. So this is the anniversary of the Pansos massacre in 2006 when they made the first presentation. And I'm going to just skim through some subsequent events to give you kind of the surface story of what's going on, and then I'm going to go back and talk about the deeper levels of what's happening. So this is a typical presentation scene. This is the son, oops. This is another a son of Maria Makin. He is receiving the reparations check for the death of their mother, or Mama Makin, Maria's grandmother. One check was presented to the entire family. They had to decide among themselves how to split that up among the siblings and the grandchildren. You'll notice he's signing with his fingerprint because most adult Kekchis were not allowed to have education, so they are illiterate. And they are primarily monolingual in the Kekchi language. They understand some Spanish, typically from living on the plantations and having to take orders, but they do not speak Spanish.
Can I ask what the going rate for being the victim of a mass murder is?
It's coming up.
Okay. Just curious.
Okay, so this is a typical scene in Pansos. This is the view behind my house. So you have the Sierra de las Minas here, the Mines mountain range. In the background, you can see how tall those mountains are. Here's the farmer tending his corn and bean seedlings that are coming up. This is the Maya tree of life. This is a ceiba. It is a national tree of Guatemala. It is important because of its sacred cosmological significance for the Maya people. And you'll see that come up in some other images in just a second. This is the town beach, the same one you saw with the beautiful scene and the painted canoe 3 years after that first image was taken. Same spot, same view. It has now been turned to sand. This is because a sugarcane company funded by international clean energy investment money has moved in down the road. They have taken over virtually all of the lands at this point. In 2008, they had taken over about 3,000 linear kilometers of land. So there was still quite a bit left. But they rerouted the Teague River. Now, I don't know, is there anybody in here who's a geologist or knows anything about rivers? Rivers always try to return back to their home course. So as the river tries to return back to its home course, it throws up sand like this as it carves its way. And so this has essentially become a desert. This is just prior to that. That should be in the opposite order. This is February 2008. This is November 2007. So about the same time, these things are happening. The reparations program is in full swing. This is the president who followed Martina Rebelón in the program. She is a survivor from another Maya ethnic group. She's a Cachiquel Maya. Rosalina Teague is giving the introductory presentation for another issuing of checks. This is in a town just down the street from Panzos. So the point is that these things are happening simultaneously. They're fighting for reparations for some violence, and they're being subjected to related forms of violence. This is a Maya ceremony. So this is at the same presentation of reparations checks. You'll see here that these men, you can kind of see it, they've laid out a square cross. These represent, the candles are placed at the 4 cardinal directions. In the center, there are 2 candles that represent the heavens and the earth coming together. And that is called the heart of the sky. And it's a central creator figure in the Maya cosmology. So prayers are done around this kind of cross. Typically they're in larger ceremonies that last longer and where you have a space for it. There's typically a round circular fire pit with a full raging fire that is tended. Yes?
Is the cross an effect of the Christian influence there, or is it right dating back prior?
No, this is prior.
Okay.
This is much prior. And they have, the reason I was pointed about saying it's a square cross is because they have tried to strip out, the elders have tried to strip out in recent years, meaning since the peace accords were signed and they have more freedom to practice traditional beliefs, they've tried to strip out Christian influences. So the Christian cross is oblong. The Maya cross is square. And that is, in their mind, a better representation of the world. It's not about a crucifix. It's about the cardinal directions and the way the universe is imagined. Okay, so this is an image from 2008 that maps the different interests, economic interests that have moved into the valley. So in this sort of army green gray color here, this is all sugarcane. Here's Panzos, the town. Here's Chichipate, that's the other town I work in. This is where Maria lives. This is the Teague River here. Here's Atheist. So you can see how much it had taken over by 2008. This is, they started testing the first samples of sugarcane. They had to test different types to see what would work in the marshy environment. They started that in 2004. They planted their first crop in 2006. You can see how fast they took over the land. They went in and bought whatever they could get their hands on. Now, there's also African palm. This dark gray color is African palm. Now, there are a couple of problems with this. Hold on just a second. The sugarcane and the African palm, neither one is a native crop. Neither one is good for an ecosystem. The prior crops that I showed you in that one of those first pictures, corn, the beans, the rice, all of those can be planted in harmony to maintain the health of an ecosystem and allow for sustainable agriculture. Those techniques have been developed over many, many years of living in that ecosystem. Sugarcane, this sugar company that originally moved in here was a Guatemalan company. It had to move because it destroyed the environment on the south coast where it had been for many years. Sugarcane is infamous because it sucks water. It will eat up all the water in its environment. Both of these plants also bring a lot of plagues, insects, diseases that harm the other plants and harm the water system in the area. So this is very dangerous for the ecosystem and for the livelihoods of the subsistence and cash cropping farmers. This is 2011. Sorry.
I'm unclear. You said that Lake Ijabal flows to the Caribbean at Livingston.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that upstream from the lake is salty marshes. So Lake Ijabal is saline?
It's kind of brackish because it's right between the sea and the river system.
But the river flowing into it is fresh water.
Yes.
And it's not tidal.
Yes. The river comes, I may have said it wrong, but the river comes from
That's
up
right.
in the mountains. It comes from the west and it flows out through the Caribbean Sea, right? And so there's the marshy system is created as those come together. And in El Estor, just because with this image, it also is pertinent to mention that El Estor here is right on the edge of Lake Isabel. Lake Isabel starts about right here. That is the site of the world's largest open-faced nickel mine. And that originally was a Canadian investment. That was established in the first land concessions or leases were given by the government illegally, according to Guatemalan law. Ministers signed it over because surely they were getting a large cut of the money. And employees of the mine committed many acts of violence and many murders in the 1970s, just prior to the Panzos massacre. So those issues also were coming to the fore in the massacre itself. Many survivors of that mine, which were directly affecting this community of Chichipate, had been involved in activist efforts against the mine and were receiving threats, or in some cases, family members were murdered because of the mine business and by mine employees. So that is also a huge factor in this violence because you have the biofuel and agri-diesel companies coming in from the west, taking over all the land this way. You have the mine coming from this way. And the mining concessions actually go way up here to the north and around El Estor, up into the mountains where they prospect. The mining company abandoned that property in 1981 because they were being accused of murdering a senator and another lawyer who was a very highly regarded academic who was investigating the legality of the mining contracts. And so they did not come back until 2004. If you remember, I told you the Cain company came in to test the first samples in 2004 as well. So these forces all of a sudden came back down on the valley just when the survivors of the violence were starting to think maybe peace was going to work. So 2011, these are forced evictions as they are happening. I had just returned from Guatemala when this occurred. This was March 15th, 2011. I was woken up at about 7 o'clock in the morning by a friend of mine who ran a nonprofit in Guatemala, and she was almost screaming, and she said, wake up, do you know what's happening in the Pueblo Chic? And I said, what are you talking about? And she goes, get up. They're marching through the valley evicting community after community. So I got up, I called my Kekchi family. They were under fire, and this often makes me cry, so just bear with me. They were under fire. This is one of the first communities that was attacked. This is a series of communities who were being pressured because they couldn't find where to plant. They had been planting and producing on the same lands for years. Some of them had been born on these lands in the Poichi, grown up as forced laborers, and were recently been working the land as under contract or rental agreements. And suddenly the sugar company comes in and the palm company comes in, and they're taking it from them all over again, and they're forcing them out. They don't have any other place to feed themselves or plant. There are no lands to be had. And so the sugar company, called Hindu Guadalupe, moved in. Like I said, they planted their first crops in 2006. The first harvest came up in 2008, and it failed. They had miscalculated the effects of the water and miscalculated or poorly assessed the ecosystem and the types of cane that they planted, and they were very upset. They forfeited their international loans. And so the bank put notice out in all public media that these lands would be up for auction. And before the owner could respond, 18 communities moved on to these properties. Some of them had just been pushed off of them, organized themselves. This is about 3,000 people, men, women, and children and elders. And they claimed them, just like they had in the 70s. They moved on to them, they started working them. Under Guatemalan law, if you are working a piece of land that has been abandoned for a certain amount of time, you can claim first right to that land. So they were acting, the Kekchi were acting on that principle, as well as the Kekchi belief that ownership is established through use, which is very different from capitalist private property law. So on this day, the owner of the sugar company went back on his word. The communities, of course, when they claimed the land, the owner got very upset. Lots of conflicts started happening. The owner sent private security guards after the people occupying or invading his land, which was really their land. And a series of conflicts ensued. All parties were forced into what's called the High Table of Negotiations, which is a mechanism of negotiation that the country of Guatemala has established under the auspices of the National Human Rights Defender. And they entered into a series of meetings. They tried to negotiate buying the land, having the government, I should say, buy the land for the communities as a kind of settlement. The bank was in agreement. Of course, the bank just wants its money. And eventually, the owner had a tantrum in one of these meetings and screamed at them that he didn't want them to have any of his land, that he was in debt $42 million, that he had already paid this to the president, and he was not going to let this happen, and he stormed out and refused to participate after that. The night before, or the day before this event here, the representatives of all of these communities were in one of these negotiations meetings. The owner was not participating anymore. And they confronted the Secretary of Agriculture and they said, we want a guarantee that there will be no violence. We are following these procedures because we want a peaceful solution. We need to eat, we need to feed our people, and we want that to happen peacefully. And the Secretary of Agriculture promised them there would be no violence. He said they were following the procedures of the law, and that he would make sure that there was no harm done to them. Before they could get home the following morning, their communities were under attack. The president and president's wife had already, whose brother, by the way, owned the sugar company, had already dispatched the troops. So here you see essentially riot police with their shields. Here, the riot police went in and paid off neighbors of these communities and shipped them in school buses, handed them upon arrival, black market or hand-me-down uniforms from the war, military uniforms. They put bandanas over their faces, and they were sent to go in, rob the harvest, rob the tools, rob whatever they could get a hold of. And then the police moved in and launched tear gas grenades at short range. You can see the gas here. This is the company tractor. You can see there is a company worker driving that. They are upturning the fields and the harvest of the people so that they can't get their food. And this happened in community after community after community. It lasted a little more than a week with them marching and evicting 1 to 2 communities each day. These are the tear gas canisters. Several people were hit with these. One of my close friends was hit in the head and almost didn't survive. These are large canisters. They are put into a gun that looks something like a machine gun. And most of these launchers can, some of them are just for tear gas. Some of them, it's sort of like, it's a toy basically. You can like flip around and choose your ammunition. So you can put bullets in it, you can put tear gas, you can, change the settings. And so those are what was used. These are, this is seriously heavy artillery. This was what was left at the scene. One man was killed this day. The government still denies that it had anything to do with it. They try to say that he was hit in the head with a machete by one of his own people. This is another scene of the women and kids trying to get all the belongings out that they can before the violence starts and the police surrounded them, or military police. This is the company tractor overturning a house. This is Teague traditional housing. It stays cooler in the tropical heat with the thatch and the cane walls. This is the owner, the First Lady's brother, personally set fire to many Kekchi homes during this wave of evictions. And this is one fire. He's got a helper here who's from a neighboring community, one of those who was paid off. They bribed them by paying them 20 quetzales more than the going rate for daily labor, which is 40 quetzales. That is about $5. So these people got paid about $8 a day to go in and help evict and, in some cases, kill their neighbors. That tells you how desperate the situation is. And this is one of the houses burning. The community members were left on the side of the road. Again, there were about 3,000 of them. They had nowhere to go, so most of them set up camps in the street or, in a neighboring field just outside the property lines, and set up like tents, temporary tents with sticks and garbage bags and things like that to keep themselves dry. They were hunted. The ones who had crops left in the field went on night patrols where the men and women would take turns sleeping in the fields at night to protect what was left of the crops because they have no other means of food. There were several incidences where armed men came and opened fire on the camps in the middle of the night. Leaders were hunted down. Some of them are still being hunted. Several of them were kidnapped. Luckily, we were able to get most of them free. There are a couple of them still in jail. And we had 3 total murders, outright murders, during that wave. And the subsequent lasted a couple months. They would go back in and try to re-evict them from the camps where they set up temporary housing. This is a press release from the government that says the government denies disrespect to human rights during the evictions. Just like the Banzos massacre, these evictions hit the media and exploded across all the international wires and the internet. We used Facebook to organize people, let people know about events where you could go, whether you're in Guatemala or in Washington, D.C., to complain. And the government just continued to manipulate things. They took pictures and videos and they manipulated them backwards and inside out. And this is a whole series of pictures. I'm just going to show you this one. But they presented a whole series. This is the opening one. with this entirely made up story about how they peacefully helped people out with pickup trucks and helped them collect their, their fertilizer and their corn, and it was awful. So I was part of a team. I was receiving phone calls every day, testimonies. People would call me with reports of who the security guards were, what the badges said, license plate numbers of people attacking them, what kinds of artillery they had, any kind of details so that we could write it up. All of us who had been working in the region came together in a team. We filed suit with the communities against the state of Guatemala in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, or Commission of Human Rights, I should say. You have to go through the commission before you can move the case to the court. We have now been arguing with the Guatemalan state for close to 5 years. And they continue to do everything possible to avoid responsibility and not do what they were mandated to do by the commission, which was provide for the physical integrity and security of the persons who were evicted, all 3,000 of them, provide temporary housing, keep people fed. Okay, and then the fourth one, get to the bottom of whatever the issue is underneath all of this conflict, which is land. And the state continues to deny that it has to do with anything having to do with land. So, these are the facts that you're going to get in the international media or from a sort of a quick take of what's been going on for the last several decades in the Polo-Chic region. Now, if you really try to get at what's going on with this violence, why is it happening, what does it mean to the different parties involved, you have to go a lot deeper. So I'm going to back up now and start talking a little bit about origin myths and the effects that they have on the actions we take in the world and how we come together as people. So cosmology or worldview, those two terms are often used interchangeably. They're slightly different, but for our purposes today, a quick definition is how humans imagine and think about the totality of the universe in time and space, and then our place in it, right? And so origin myths explain how a particular people came to be on the earth. So we all know about the Christian origin myth, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden. We have our sacred book, the Bible, for Christians. Every religion has their sacred book and their sacred origin story. For the Maya, it is heart of sky. Remember, that is where the horizon meets, right? The earth meets the sky. Heart of sky makes men out of maize. This is why corn is still a sacred crop. And the sacred book is the Popol Vuh. This is a glyph. It's a drawing of a glyph that came from a stela, which is like a glyph panel that's done in carved in stone. And you can see here, remember I showed you the tree of life. This is a tree of life here, with the trunk going down. This represents where the horizon comes together. This is also, can be fire, can be water. Again, that ties into the idea of the tree of life, and also the fire as the connector and the medium through which humans communicate with the gods, or God, or the universe, however you want to call it. Then you have here the cardinal directions. Okay? Here's the tree of life again. And here you can see much more clearly, this is the horizon line. The earth is meeting this blue, which is the sky. There is an underworld in my cosmology. It is not the equivalent of the Christian hell. It is, however, under the earth. It's on the other side of the earth's surface. So the tree of life roots reach just as deeply underneath as they do above, and there's a whole series of myths that take place as warrior There's a set of warrior twins who have to go down into the underworld and they have to prove themselves as one of the hero stories of the Maya people.
Is this archaeological based or oral tradition or literature?
All of the above. Yeah. This is a modern, more recent picture. So this is not, this one is from a glyph, which is from the ancient Maya civilization, the classic Maya. This is a more contemporary depiction of the same kind of ideas. So you'll see here these 4 different colors: black, white, red, and yellow. These are the colors of corn, black being sometimes is depicted as blue, kind of purple for the blue corn. These are also the colors of human skin. You'll see these colors in many Native American from United States and Canada nations as well. You'll see the same colors used. These represent the 4 directions. Each one of them is they always go with the same direction, in other words. So all together, the colors are the black, white, red, and yellow, and then the green and blue, where the earth and the sky come together. Here is the corn growing and the beans growing together, just like they've always been planted traditionally together. This helps give nutrients to the soil and maintain the soil so that it can be, agriculture can be done on it in successive plantings or seasons. And this is related, the idea of men of maize is related to the idea of the Kekchi self, which I'm going to go into in more detail now. Because when the Maya say we're men of maize, and that is, that's not just for the Kekchi, that's for all Maya. So there are about 30 different Mayan ethnic groups and languages. They mean that in a very profound sense. It's not just that they plant corn as a traditional staple crop. It's that the understanding of the body for the Maya and how forces in the universe work is very much based in energy and forces. And so if you are taking into your body the maize, then the maize is what forms your body in a very literal, material sense, and also a spiritual sense, and these two overlap in that way. So for the Kekchi, this is a very fundamental part of their understanding of the world and understanding of themselves as humans. So just to kind of outline a few of the different ways that these cosmological differences play out in material life, I'm going to just list a few here. The first one is time and space. So many agricultural peoples, the Maya included, do not traditionally follow a linear time frame. The Kekchi understand linear time, but just like all of us, they also operate according to other senses of time. Now you can think about in your own life, we also have different ideas of time, right? You have a calendar for the tax year, for instance. That is different than the calendar for the school year, and that's different than the calendar for your respective holidays for whatever spiritual or religious practice you might or might not participate in. So those are all different senses of time that are based in different priorities or values. So for many agricultural people, their primary understanding of time is circular because it's based on agricultural cycles, which are based on planetary movements. And so the Maya watched the stars, and many of you might know this if you have watched any sort of pop culture, New Age interpretation of Maya belief or horrid Hollywood movie on the subject. They're entertaining, but they're not based in actual fact for the most part. But the Maya primarily operate on a cyclical understanding or circular understanding of time. So cycles for the agricultural season do this, and mapped on top of that are many of the other activities of daily life. So I'm going to pass around 2 Maya calendars. These are recent publications. This is from 2008, and I'll pass, there's 2 copies. You can see on here that this is a circular, this is a very different looking calendar than the one we typically use. This is the typical Maya calendar that is still in use. You will see the Mayan numbers. You see the Mayan glyphs, which represent powers. Each power represents a certain force of energy that is dominant on that particular day. And these are all based in the cycle of the sun and the cycle of the moon, and how those cycles work together. And it would be another talk to go into that detail, but it is mapped onto the calendar that we use. So you'll see in Spanish the names of the Western months and the Western days and the Western numbers. Okay, so you can see how those fit together. I'll start over here.
Maybe start in the back.
Is it a solar?
It integrates the cycle of the rotation of the sun and the rotation of the moon. So it's just a super summary would be that it's about 13 months of 20 days instead of the 12 days. This is a more accurate calendar than the calendar we keep. And they were still some of the most skilled mathematicians and astronomers in the world. They were among the first to invent the zero. They have more accurate calculations of astronomical movement than some of our contemporary calculations. And we still use those, scientists still use those. So this idea of time also affects ideas of space. If you're imagining time goes in a cycle, then you're understanding its effect on space in a different way as well. As you saw in those glyphs, this is a very different understanding of how the universe is structured than our typical Christian heaven and hell, and it's very linear, and they've mapped onto these linear timelines. That's very different than everything going in cycles. Okay, so this affects, as I already mentioned, the idea of the self and the body. Boundaries are fluid for most Maya people, and so the energy that comes in with the maze travels through your body. The heart for the Kekchi is the center. A common saying, when you ask someone in Kekchi, how are you? You say, Masas alachol, which means, how are you in your heart? Inside your heart. And to answer that I'm well, you say, my heart is full. Okay, salichol, I'm full in my heart. And so this is a very different understanding of what well-being is, because for most Westerners, especially in the United States, we're very centered in our heads. All of our psychology and much of our religious belief is centered from an intellectual jumping off point instead of a heart-centered jumping off point. Now that heart then literally distributes the energies that are taken in throughout the rest of the body. And it is said that to really know something, you have to know it in your heart. So Kekchi knowing, rather than being centered in the mind, is centered in the heart and the body. And this has drastic ramifications in terms of how Kekchis come together with more Western understandings and people who are operating from a more intellectual frame of mind. This also has effects in medicine. That's again another talk, but it drastically affects, for instance, aid efforts, efforts to deal with certain diseases that become widespread in a certain area, like HIV, or more common diseases that are easily cured with antibiotics. Simply providing antibiotics is not going to work, because you have to get to the bottom of the cultural understandings of how the body works and how disease happens in order to get people to use antibiotics effectively, for instance. And again, that's another talk, so I'm going to skip through it. Individualism versus communitarianism. So what is our system of our worldview based on in this country? Individualism, which comes from, what's that?
Magna Carta.
Yeah, it goes way back. Individual rights are established there, you're right. And how do we maintain that? What was the Magna Carta about? Who was it written there?
We cover. No, that was King John.
So, colonists, right? What were the colonists and the conquerors doing?
Colonizing and conquering.
Colonizing and conquering for what?
For God.
For their rights.
For God. Well, they were backing what they were doing up with God.
Right.
But what was it they were after?
Land and wealth.
Land and wealth, right? Money. And that establishes capitalism, right? Capitalism is based on the individual, right? We're taught from the time we're born, we gotta grow up, we gotta pull ourselves up from the bootstrap, we've got the Protestant work ethic that anybody can make this happen if you work hard enough, and it's up to each individual to make his, and more recently her, own way, right? Now, for those of us who grew up in capitalism, we have always imagined ourselves as individuals, but if we think about where that comes from, when we're born as part of a family, right? And we are thought to be incapable of taking care of ourselves. We have to depend on our mother and father or whoever our caretakers are. And then eventually we're educated and we're pushed to be more and more independent, to separate from the family. And our ultimate goal is always on a linear timeline of progress and accomplishment where we work harder and harder and harder and harder to become more of an individual, because in the capitalist system, that will provide us with more wealth and thereby feed the capitalist system. Now, for a Maya person, it's the opposite. A Maya person is born as an individual, and the goal is to become more social and more communitarian. So if you're working as a Maya child, you're born into a family as an individual. You're separated from everyone else. They don't know who you are yet. You don't know who they are. You are influenced by their teaching and their care in the family. And then you are taught how to behave in the family, what your role is, how to take care of your family members, how to let them take care of you. And it's a very cooperative family system. Then as you graduate from that, you take on more and more responsibility in the community, and the ultimate goal is to become a community leader and pass on those teachings to new generations. So this is very different. If you do not think of yourself as an adult who is an individual separated from other individuals, and you're having to interact with an entire system based on an individual atomistic idea of the person, you can imagine there are going to be a lot of conflicts. Some of those, many of them, get played out because of the law and the way that our laws are written. So if you look back, in Guatemalan, for instance, in Guatemalan constitutional law, the Constitution was redone in 1982 at the height of the violence, and then it's had several rounds of amendments since then. After the violence ended, they rewrote some of it so that it would become more inclusive. Now, international lawyers from all over the world were coming in, experts on peace and reconciliation were coming in, and they were advising the Guatemalan government on how to do this and what it had to say so that it didn't offend anybody, and it took into consideration all of the Maya people and the Garifuna people who were African descendants, as well as the European descended, what are considered Latinos, which are more white-skinned people. So if you read this document, it looks great. It looks like everybody's included, everybody gets to participate, but that's not how it plays out. So if you go back and you look at how legal transactions are playing out, you get to back to the definition of a person that is in the Constitution. The definition of a person, according to Guatemalan law, which is based in Western European traditions of law, thank you, is that a Guatemalan citizen is a person who was born within Guatemalan boundaries and who is born to a mother and a father who have particular names, and the child is given the names of each of those parents. So, if you don't abide by those naming customs, you can't prove your parentage, and you can't prove you're a legal person in many cases. This plays out in reparations here. So many Mayan people, though the Constitution says that everybody should be included, everybody according to a very Western perspective and worldview, not according to a Mayan worldview. And so this causes all kinds of problems when you have Mayans trying to file suit against a European Guatemalan legal system.
So is it relatively an official standard there that these indigenous people are not considered as persons?
Yes. Yes is the big general answer. It plays out in racist violence throughout the country, economic terrorism. During the evictions, there was a documentary film made, which I can point you to if any of you are interested, where some of the workers, the government workers who are there as defenders of human rights, are saying straight out to the camera, these people are backwards. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand development. And that goes back to the idea that they're not fully human. They're not able to think right.
They're not fully recognized as citizens entitled to all the constitutional rights.
Because they're not recognized as full persons.
And that's,
the Guatemalan legal system cannot or will not recognize Mayan personhood.
don't want to belabor the point, but I would imagine that the international organizations that try to monitor human rights and such would take great exception with this.
Yes, but this happens all over the world. And it is sort of, it's one of those ongoing challenges. Well, how do we figure out a solution? We've tried, for instance, there are a couple of ways I can give examples of how this plays out. One is reparations, which I'll get to in a second as an example. Another one is property. So for Guatemalans, ownership is through use. It's not through some piece of paper. And so if Guatemalans to the Teague, they own that land because they're the ones working it. Not the patron who lives in some other city and only comes down every few months to check on his finca, which is a plantation, right? One of the ways the Teague work the land in a community. So one of the ways that we've tried to deal with this is that Guatemala has collective land rights. So a community can own the title to a property. So there are two properties down by the edge of the Teague that have some of the prime farmlands in the region. And one community is 96 families, the others is 98. And they work that as a community. They have work days when all the men go out and they help each other with different tasks. They reinforce the boundaries, they set up drainage canals, whatever the tasks are. They negotiate with potential buyers as a community. They make decisions. Now, sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't, because then it ensures that it's harder to sell the property because you have to have the agreement of all the people in the community whose names are on the title. But it's also problematic because you can't, all kinds of little ramifications and loopholes come up. And just having a community title, a communal title, doesn't necessarily mean you can protect your property, is the bottom line. So that's one way that we've tried to deal with that. It also makes it difficult if you as an individual want to sell your part, you can't. right? And there were similar systems tried out in Mexico that have now been abolished because they had too many problems. It was called the Ejido system. Now, one of the ways that I just mentioned during that example is that when you have a community and you need to make a decision, they practice democracy, but for the Kekchi and most Mayan groups, democratic practice is what I call a deep democracy. It means literally you sit in a room and every man and woman has the opportunity to speak their mind, and eventually you hope you come to a consensus. So when the municipalities, for instance, European groups, governments come in and they sponsor reform or aid programs, and they go in and they say, we're going to help you increase the efficiency of your local governance and your governmental bodies. So one project like this was trying to build these little development councils, and so the Kekchi people from the various communities would come together with representatives of the municipality to plan the economic development of the municipality. Well, the mayor would call for a vote, and the Kekchi people would just stare at each other. Nobody got a chance to talk. Nobody got a chance to really deliberate the issues. And the mayor would take his vote and slam down a gavel, and that would be it. So representation is affected, because even though you institute these, what to a Western mind is supposed to be participatory, you're not getting full mind participation or representation, because the systems, the people managing that system are not understanding the views and the sort of the way knowledge works and cooperation works for the Maya. I think I've covered all of these. So I'm just going to scan back through some of the images. Most of these we've seen before to close, just so we can think about these issues again in light of what I've just explained. Yeah. I think it's coming out in just a second. That's the big example I'm going to give to show you how this comes together. So here's your field again, with the Maya tree of life and the farmer planting. Now this, again, this may not look like it, but this is a walking trail through fields. Most of these trees have uses, and plants have uses, whether medicinal or fuel or food sources, and they go all the way up into these mountains. And all of this land is considered sacred land. This is a typical Kekchi house. So this is just a little, there's a handful of slides here to show you the living conditions in which these Kekchi are forced to work. And remember, these are the people who made your coffee and bananas. Many of them still make your coffee and bananas, and your nickel, and your clean energy for your car, which is not clean at all if you haven't caught on to that. So this is a one-family home. This particular family has 4 children and 2 parents. So this is the living quarters, and this is a little enclosure for the sink, which is also, it's like you know what a pila is. We'll see one in a minute. It's a particular kind of sink common in Latin America that is used for everything. So each family typically has one water spigot, and that one is here. You see the clotheslines there. This is one form of architecture. It is somewhat unusual to have enough resources to build a plank wood house. Most people build homes out of cane that is gathered from the wild. And this roof is in good condition. This one's needing repair. This is sheet metal that's bought in small panels and then put together to make roofs. And that's extremely hot, and it's not the preferred roofing material. The preferred material is thatch. This is the inside of a typical kitchen. So here you can see the cane that's gathered. It's tied together with, used to be vines that were dried. Now it's more commonly nylon rope like you get at the 99-cent store. There is a fire pit, usually central to the kitchen. Here you see the ash, the pots. This is a typical water spigot area. Notice there is no plumbing. except for the spigot itself. So drainage water just runs everywhere. Families try to deal with that in different ways depending on the topography of where their spigot is placed. This family has put up some these are old women's skirts to kind of provide a little bit of privacy, because this spigot, remember, has to be used for everything. So this is where you bathe, this is where you wash food, this is where you clean chickens, this is where you do laundry, everything. And then the gray water is polluting everything around your house, and your animals are drinking from it, and then you eat the animals. This is one of the poorer, the bathrooms in poor condition. Okay, this is a latrine toilet seat that was donated by an aid organization. This is the basket of torn up newspapers that you would use for toilet paper. And they propped it up on this platform. Ideally, you would have a little house around this, but this family is too poor for that. So it's propped up in the air. The waste falls down here, and it's all open. So this leads, as you might imagine, to struggles with disease and just general hygiene. This is a pila. So a pila is 3 chambers. This central one is the water basin, and the faucet is here. You can't really see it through the plants. Then you have a basin with a washboard bottom on one side, and you have another deeper sink with a plain bottom on the other side, so that you can accomplish all your tasks related to water in the same sink. So you see the laundry up here. This is for food here with the kind of strainer basket. And they provided a little bit of a roof. Okay, so now we're going to jump back to reparations. So the majority of the people who were affected by the violence, either they had direct immediate family members killed or disappeared, or they themselves were tortured or raped or kidnapped, or some combination of those. Usually each family has someone who was murdered and they themselves were abused because the military targeted particular families like the Maquins and other people who organized like them and were thought to be communist guerrillas. So most of those families were somewhat better off before the worst of the violence. So this level of poverty you're seeing hasn't, in some ways it hasn't changed that much. I mean, they didn't have plumbing before, they don't have plumbing now. But for many families, their day-to-day existence is much poorer. They don't have as many domesticated animals, they don't have access to land. Key things like that that help you maintain a certain standard of living. So when the reparations organization started putting together how it was going to sort of structure the program and make the program operate, they did consult the victims. They called meetings in 2005. There were 2 different meetings nationally. Buses came to our towns, picked us up, shipped us to the Capitol. We all camped out together. I was the only white person, but I was let in as a member of the victims organization because they just said so, and the people in charge didn't know how to argue with them. So these meetings took place over several days where everybody camped out together and then sat in deliberations day after day trying to sort out how it would be best to do this. So victims did get a say in how the program was structured. However, when it came down to implementing it, practical matters took over. So at this first presentation of checks, here's the ceremony. This is started the night before. This is how the Kekchi respond. They prepare for any kind of big event or potential happening by conducting a Maya ceremony. This was a really big one. They built a huge fire. It's a 24-hour vigil, and you tend the fire, you have a priest or priestess who watches the reactions of the flames, and that communicates how the universe has responded and what will likely transpire or what decision they should lean toward. People pray in each of the cardinal directions, and then you have to go around the fire in one direction, go around the fire in another direction. It's all about maintaining balance and aligning everyone's energy and intentions in the same direction toward the outcome that the community wants or what will be best for them. So this is a way of bringing the community together around important issues. So this woman is placing one of the candles on one of the cardinal directions. You'll see the incense holder here and the flowers and different items in each of the colors for those directions. This is the fire pit with my priest tending the fire and other people praying as he prepares it. This is the picture you saw before, the presentation. This is Avelino, this is Andres Maquin, Mama Maquin's son, receiving his check. Now this is Maria. Now Maria is the granddaughter of Mama Maquin. Now the way the reparations system is set up is a two-part process. So remember, I reminded you about how the Constitution was redone in 1982. Then after the peace accords, it was redone to become more multicultural and inclusive, and it was including human rights protections in that Constitution. And that came together also in the reparations, the legal framework of the reparations program, which was based on international law. Now, according to that program, and the legal framework that was set out in the agreement, human rights violations and crimes against humanity are to be compensated as follows. These are the different crimes: enforced disappearance, extrajudicial execution, physical and psychological torture, forced displacement, forced conscription of minors by the paramilitary forces, sexual violence and sexual rape, violations against children, massacres, and other violations not contained in the present regulations, this is straight from the legal papers, made known and resolved by the National Reparations Commission. So in other words, if something else came up that needed to be addressed, there was a mechanism for that. Now, you have to go back to the definitions of a person and the definitions of a victim, because in the two-part process, the first part is establishing that your identity as a person and how you are related to a victim. And thereby, if you can prove those two things, you might be a beneficiary. Now, the second part is establishing your victimhood. So a victim, by definition, is a civilian who suffered directly or indirectly, individually or collectively, violations of her or his human rights and crimes against humanity considered by the reparations program. So this seems pretty inclusive.
Same as citizen. Civilian is a citizen, right? No.
A civilian is a person who has never performed military duty.
So we're in overtime now. We're past our endpoint.
Yes, I'm sure we are, and this is the very end. So
Okay.
I think it's just a couple more slides to wrap this up. This goes on. This is still the definition of victim, right? It's a civilian who suffered these crimes. It goes on to include the emotional, physical, and mental harm and economic loss. And so this all seems pretty inclusive in terms of who's a victim as well as who's a person. People can get the monetary payments and become beneficiaries if they're victims or relatives of victims. So if you're the spouse or live-in partner, if you're the children, the father and mother, or the siblings, okay, this is immediate family members of victims. And so there's a two-part process. What happens, and this just elaborates the documents you have to turn in, that's not that important. You're going for these prizes, okay? For a dead person, you might receive 24,000 quetzales, which is roughly equivalent to $3,200. For a tortured or raped person who may still be alive, you might receive $2,667. And for an ex-paramilitary, you might receive an equivalent of about $160. And people will spend almost this same amount just to get the reparations check, because the acknowledgement is just as important, or not more important, as the money. Most people say the checks help a little, but they don't last a long time. And this is just an example. This is my Kekchi mother, and she got a new cement floor with her check. Two-part process. What happens, this is the deliberative democracy and the community coming together to help all of the applicants, is that things come up in the bureaucracy, like names. If you don't have the name of your father and you can't raise the money to pay for copies of his birth certificate, or you can't find it because it was on some plantation that burned the records during the war, or it was flooded out in the municipality where it was stored, or you don't know where your father was born because he couldn't read or write and he didn't care about the paper. If you can't prove those things, you can't prove that you might be a beneficiary, because you cannot prove your identity as a person related to a victim. This has the effect of ultimately meaning that the reparations Guatemalan law will not recognize not only Kekchi personhood, but kinship relationships. And I pointed out Maria just a minute ago because she, as the granddaughter of Mama King, cannot and will not ever receive a reparations check for her grandmother's death, even though her grandmother was her mother figure. Her grandmother raised her. Kinship is again about action and not just about blood or names for the Kekchi. So these things play out, and it turns out that some of our most famous victims and biggest activists can't get recognized for the harms that they experienced. And then what happens in the testimony is this, to take it one step further, when they go to the second part where they have to give their testimony of the harms done them. If you have a victim who expresses that, for instance, I have one colleague who was kidnapped multiple times. He was held in captivity and used as a guide by the army. He was tortured on multiple occasions, and he escaped. Well, the moment he said he escaped, they disqualified him from reparations, because that disqualifies him from being a victim because he exhibited bravery and courage. Other people who have experienced injuries, like this woman who's a survivor of the massacre, she bears the physical scars on her body of where the bullet went in and where the bullet went out, and she does not qualify for reparations. She survived. So these are just a few examples. Just to wrap up this example and the story as a whole, one of the sons of Mama King got really upset and one day said to me, "They're asking for too many papers. They say our files are not complete. They want us to prove things on paper. But we suffered all of this. Why don't they just believe us?" And so that's where I'll stop for today. Up to you whether you want to allow for questions.
Thank you for presenting that. So we are over time, but I don't see anybody else trying to get in here. So you can ask questions until somebody does try to kick us out, I guess.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to visit the Ten Highlands on 87 or 88, and crossing the frontier from Belize, the bus was stopped, a public bus was stopped several times, and as I started asking questions after this happened, I saw what happened. It turned out that the military that were stopping us with American F-16s, but 16-year-old kids basically, were from another part of Guatemala. And you seem to indicate that for 20 quinzales, local people would act as scabs in these dislocations.
Are you speaking about the evictions
Yeah.
in particular? Well, the valley is big, remember, so the Panzos municipality, there are probably, there's about 10,000 people, probably more just in the municipal seat, the urban area, and a lot more in the rural areas surrounding it. So when you say local, it kind of depends on what you mean. These workers that were brought in as paramilitaries, basically, to perform the evictions or to help with the evictions, were from communities nearby, but they were from the whole valley. So they must, you have to keep in mind that when you have workers the Kekchi have to migrate to work a lot of times, so they're hiking all over the place to go to work on different plantations or to get contract labor for a day here and a day there. So a lot of them know each other, even though they may live in communities that we would consider rather far apart. Also, transportation, is limited, so you have vans that run between towns, but getting even, at that time, the pavement was not paved, it was gravel roads, and so getting even 30 miles down the road may take a couple hours. So those paramilitaries that brought in on buses were from neighboring communities. Sometimes they were from right next door, right across the boundary line. Sometimes they were from a little bit up in the mountains. Sometimes they were from a little bit down in the valley. They got whoever they could. They basically just marched through the valley and loaded the school buses as they went. And a lot of the Kekchi were forced to work on these cane plantations or the African palm plantations as well. They also had, so they were at work when the company boss came in and said, hey, you want a little extra money? And the bosses for those palm and sugar plantations are the ones who loaded those buses. And then they brought them and they all helped burn out the communities that they thought needed to be burned out. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it seems like the military was very conscious, I guess probably from past experience, to take people from different regions and ship them to a new region, so they weren't meeting any relatives.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, it was much more complicated than that, even in the 80s. Because you have migrant laborers who are live in one area and they work in another area for a contract of maybe a few weeks, and then they go home and they go back for a few weeks. So they're going to see relatives. And there were times in the 80s, for instance, where you may have a rotating military force coming through towns, taking up residents in a local school for a matter of a few months, and then leaving. They commit crimes while they're there. They kill a bunch of people. They'll gather, in one instance in El Estor, they gathered up all the dead and they put them on the basketball court. And they had anybody who was around come in, and they were ordered to, and one of the sons of Mama Keen told me this story, personal experience. They were ordered to go walk through the dead bodies and identify their relatives. And he said, we all knew that if we showed any recognition of any of those people, then we would be shot on sight. And so he describes the experience of going through the bodies and seeing his family members and not being able to respond. So it was very complicated. The military was very savvy. They had American advisors, advising them on psychological manipulation and torture. There was a lot of skill that went into the violence that was committed then and what's being committed now. Other questions?
So there's a documentary.
There is a documentary. If you go to YouTube and you punch in Tolochic evictions, it should come up. And it's Polocic. Yeah.
What is being committed now?
What's up?
What is being committed now?
Well, these kinds of evictions are committed all the time. There are hundreds of them per year. People can't find land. One of the tactics that the Guatemalan government is using with those communities you saw in those slides of evictions is that they try to starve them out. So there's neocolonial economic terrorism with regard to the clean energy funding that is international. And then the government participating in that by they would rather have the people dead and out of the way so that they can export these crops and get the international money. There are a lot of other sorts of violence going on. I mean, Guatemala has one of the highest rates of femicide, just like Juarez in Mexico on the Texas border. You've got a really high degree of disparity between the wealthy and the poor. About, in the Pansos municipality, 98% of the population is indigenous, 2% is non-indigenous, and 2% own about 99% of the resources.
Has someone consulted with an expert at international law to where there be some sort of way to identify a tribe and allow them to have rights similar to what we have American Indians here in our country?
Well, the Maya are not organized by tribe. Tribe is a type of political organization or government structure, and the Maya are simply not organized that way. That was the attempt that was being made with the Constitution, and including equal rights for all indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples in the Constitution. But they are organized loosely as ethnic groups. There has been something called the Pan-Maya movement. It has since died out because it was based loosely on a Maya identity that was an effort to bring all Maya peoples together, but all Maya peoples are not organized on a daily basis together. They have their communities, they have their ethnic groups more immediately, and they're tied to their lands and their territories. So when I work with international lawyers, and I specialize in international law as an anthropologist, it's one of my specialties. Like I said, we organized a team and filed suit against the country of Guatemala for these evictions, and we can't get anywhere. I mean, the Guatemalan government just doesn't want to do anything. And international law is difficult because human rights mechanisms, there's the Inter-American system. People in the Americas can access international law structures through two different mechanisms, the United Nations mechanism and the Inter-American system. Both of those it's voluntary to be a signatory to those systems. So you find the Inter-American Commission and the Inter-American Court in positions in which they don't want to pressure the government of Guatemala or Nicaragua or Mexico or whatever, because then that government just says, well, we'll just leave. We'll just leave. We don't want to do what you want. And so their power is really weak, and there's very little means of enforcement.
Thanks again.